In the spring of the year 40 after the birth of Christ, a woman named Livia Orestilla stood in the imperial palace in Rome, her hands trembling, her face pale with terror, waiting to be brought before the emperor. Livia was 28 years old, the wife of Senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Rome. 3 days earlier, her husband had been arrested on charges of treason, charges that everyone in Rome knew were fabricated, based on nothing more than the fact that Piso had failed to laugh enthusiastically enough at one of the emperor's jokes during a public banquet. Livia had not been allowed to see her husband since his arrest. She did not know where he was being held or what was happening to him. She had been summoned to the palace by imperial guards who would not answer her questions, who had dragged her from her home despite her protests, who had brought her to this anteroom where she now waited. Hearing sounds from beyond the door, laughter, the clink of wine cups, music, and beneath it all, sounds she could not identify but that filled her with a dread so profound that she felt she might vomit. The door opened. A guard beckoned her forward. Livia entered the great dining hall of the palace and saw a sight that would be seared into her memory for however many hours or days she had left to live. The Emperor Caligula reclined on a couch at the center of the room, surrounded by his closest companions and advisors, all of them drinking wine from golden cups. The remains of an elaborate feast covered the tables: roasted meats, exotic fruits, delicacies imported from across the empire. The guests were laughing and talking, the atmosphere festive, celebratory, and in the corner of the room, chained to a pillar, beaten so badly that his face was unrecognizable beneath the blood and swelling, was Livia's husband, Piso. He was naked. His body showed signs of torture, burns, cuts, bruises covering every visible surface. He was barely conscious, his head hanging forward, breathing in shallow, labored gasps. But what made Livia's blood freeze? What made her understand in that instant that something far worse than her husband's torture was about to happen was the way Caligula was looking at her. The emperor was 27 years old, handsome in the way that portraits depicted him, but his eyes held something that Livia had never seen in another human being. Not madness, exactly. Not simple cruelty, but something colder and more terrible. A kind of playful curiosity, as if Livia were an insect that he was about to pull the wings off, and he wanted to see how long she would continue trying to fly. Caligula gestured for Livia to approach. She did, her legs barely able to carry her. When she stood before the emperor's couch, he smiled at her and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "Your husband is a traitor. He has plotted against me. The penalty for treason is death, as you know. But I am a merciful emperor, and I am willing to offer you a choice." Livia's voice shook as she asked what choice she could possibly have. Caligula's smile widened. "You can watch your husband die slowly over the next 3 days while we continue our feast, tortured in ways that will make what you see now seem gentle. Or you can take his place at my table tonight, as my guest, as my companion, and your husband will be executed quickly and cleanly tomorrow morning. The choice is yours." What happened to Livia Orestilla in that dining hall over the next 6 hours would become one of the most whispered about events in Rome, spoken of in horrified tones by those who had witnessed it or heard about it from others who were there. What Caligula forced her to do, the humiliations she endured while her husband watched from his chains, the ways in which the emperor used her body and her suffering as entertainment for his guests. These details were recorded by historians who documented Caligula's reign, preserved as examples of the depths of cruelty that absolute power can produce. But before I tell you what happened to Livia Orestilla, before I reveal the full horror of what Caligula did to her and her husband, I need to tell you about the emperor himself, about how a young man who had been beloved by the Roman people when he took power had transformed into a monster whose torture methods were so brutal, so inventive, so psychologically devastating that they shocked even the Romans, a people who regularly watched gladiators kill each other for entertainment and who thought nothing of crucifying slaves. This is the story of Caligula's most brutal torture methods, the story of how an emperor used pain and humiliation as instruments of power, how he turned torture into theater and suffering into spectacle, how he created a reign of terror so complete that senators would tremble at his approach and noblewomen would kill themselves rather than be summoned to the palace. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I am about to describe is documented in historical sources written by people who lived during or shortly after Caligula's reign, recorded by Roman historians who had access to eyewitness accounts and official records, preserved because the Romans themselves were horrified by what Caligula had done and wanted to ensure that history would remember him as a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power is given to someone who uses it without restraint or mercy. If you want to understand how tyranny actually functions, how torture becomes a language of power, how systematic cruelty can be used to control an entire society through terror, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand power, cruelty, and the depths to which human beings can sink when given authority over others with no limits and no accountability. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about how torture has been used throughout history as a tool of political control. Now let me tell you about Caligula, because to understand what happened to Livia Orestilla and thousands of others during his reign, you need to understand the man who ordered these things. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, in the year 12 after the birth of Christ, into the most powerful family in Rome. His great-grandfather was the Emperor Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire. His father was Germanicus, one of Rome's greatest generals and most beloved public figures. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman known for her intelligence and strength of character. Caligula grew up in military camps on the German frontier where his father commanded the legions, and the soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, because as a small child he wore miniature military boots like the soldiers wore. Caligula's childhood was privileged but traumatic. His father Germanicus died when Caligula was 7, possibly poisoned by political enemies. His mother and 2 of his brothers were arrested on charges of treason and died in exile or in prison, victims of the paranoia of the Emperor Tiberius, who suspected everyone of plotting against him. Caligula survived by being careful, by making himself useful to Tiberius, by never showing any ambition or giving any cause for suspicion. He lived with Tiberius on the island of Capri for 6 years, watching the elderly emperor become increasingly paranoid and cruel, learning lessons about power that would shape his own reign. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula was 24 years old and the only surviving male heir of the imperial family. The Roman Senate and people welcomed his accession to power with genuine joy. They remembered his father, Germanicus, with love. They hoped that this young emperor would restore the honor and dignity that had been lost under Tiberius's paranoid and cruel rule. The early months of Caligula's reign seemed to fulfill these hopes. He was generous, giving bonuses to soldiers and gifts to the people. He restored political rights that Tiberius had suppressed. He held magnificent games and spectacles. He seemed to be everything Rome had hoped for: young, energetic, generous, a worthy successor to Augustus. Then, in October of 37, just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is not clear from the historical sources, possibly encephalitis, possibly some other brain infection or fever. For several days he was near death. Rome held its breath, praying for the recovery of their beloved young emperor. He survived, but something fundamental had changed. The man who emerged from that illness was not the same person who had fallen sick. The Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades after Caligula's death but drawing on contemporary sources and eyewitness accounts, describe the change in stark terms. Before the illness, Caligula had been, if not perfect, at least normal, ambitious, perhaps a bit vain, but functioning within the bounds of acceptable imperial behavior. After the illness, he became something else. He began to exhibit extreme cruelty, sadism, sexual perversion, and megalomania. He started to claim that he was a living god, equal to Jupiter himself. He began to torture and kill people, not out of any rational political calculation, but seemingly for his own amusement, to relieve boredom, to demonstrate his absolute power over life and death. Modern historians debate whether the illness caused brain damage that altered Caligula's personality, whether it triggered a latent mental illness, or whether the illness was simply a convenient turning point that allowed Caligula to stop pretending to be the person Rome wanted him to be and to reveal his true nature, shaped by a childhood watching his family destroyed, and by 6 years living with Tiberius on Capri, learning the darkest lessons about power. But whatever the cause, the change was dramatic and terrifying. Within months of his recovery, Caligula began implementing torture methods and public cruelties that went far beyond anything Rome had seen, even under Tiberius's worst excesses. And what made Caligula's torture methods particularly horrifying was not just their brutality, but their creativity, their psychological sophistication, their theatrical quality. Caligula did not torture people simply to extract information or to punish crimes. He tortured people as performance, as spectacle, as a way of demonstrating his absolute power and of entertaining himself and his circle. Torture became, in his hands, a kind of art form, a perverse art certainly, but one that showed a disturbing level of thought and planning. Let me tell you about the first principle